Right. So following on from this idea of exponential growth, humans seem to be, and maybe turkeys as well, seem to be poor at being able uh, to imagine that they're on this exponential curve. And so Ray Kurzweil, for example, another famous futurist, said that our intuition about the future is linear, but the reality of IT, as we've already been discussing in this episode, Azeem, is exponential. Uh, and you similarly, in your book, you talked about in chapter 3 how, for example, the COVID pandemic, when that was unfurling in 2020 around the world, it was experiencing exponential growth. And I experienced that in real time, looking at, I was like many times every day, probably 100 times a day, refreshing how much in New York State, how
Right.
many more infections there were.
Yeah.
And it was very difficult for me, even as somebody, with a lot of statistical background, been a data scientist for a decade. Even for me, it was difficult to kind of process how this exponential change was happening. So yeah, so given the difficulties that even experts face in predicting exponential growth or being able to have intuitions about exponential growth, how can businesses, policymakers, our listeners better prepare for future technological shifts?
I agree. It's really difficult to normalize and rationalize in your head the speed of that change. I I do think that it's quite commonplace. A very simple exponential process is compound interest, and virtually all of us start saving for our pensions or 401ks or whatever it happens to be too late. Right, the right time to start is when you're 23 and you just put $10 a month away, knowing it's going to compound. And I think many of us are guilty of that. I am as well. I think there are companies who have internalized this possibility, and I think the technology industry, as it comes out of the Bay Area, has very much done that. They have relied on understanding that Moore's law keeps driving prices down, and that you aren't really going to uh, systemically run out of capacity or compute. You may have crunch periods where you can't onboard the machines or the hard drives or the storage fast enough, but in general you won't do that. So I think that one of the ways that you have to understand this is understand the processes and understand that these processes absolutely exist. And I think it's really unhelpful for when you're trying to make sense of this world, for people to think in linear terms. And I still see it, and I'm sure you may see it when you're helping clients or people at work, and you see their business plan, and it shows a sort of a fixed increment of growth, and nothing grows that way. Everything follows a phase of a logistic S curve where you have an exponential phase that tails off. Nothing is linear except for our birthdays, 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. So I think a lot of the tools are to hand, but it is very difficult. And what you need to do at these moments is perhaps go back to first principles thinking, and perhaps say, look, the heuristics we've used were just that. They were really helpful in a world that doesn't move as quickly, but in a world that moves this quickly, we have to go back to first principle thinking. And the thing that's so funny, John, is that most people who are listening to this podcast will have, beyond their experience with COVID, they will have lived through exponential technologies, because they will have lived through upgrading their iPhone or their Android phone every 2 years and getting twice as much compute for the dollar they spend. They will have lived through, if they're data scientists, their data array or their data lake going from a gigabyte to 100 gigabytes to 10 terabytes to a petabyte and beyond, right? They've literally witnessed it, and yet it still becomes quite difficult. I think going back to first principles is a really helpful way of doing that.
Yeah. And so in terms of something that people could be doing, this idea of first principles in this instance here, that's literally thinking about, sketching for yourself those kinds of changes and thinking about how you adapted to those changes and making projections based on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of doing it. I mean, when I do my own planning and build models of where the business might go or where usage might go. And I've done this for more than 20 years. I've never put in linear increases like, oh, it'll go up by 20, it'll go up by 20. I've always gone in and put in a dynamic percentage, because a percentage compounds. And if one of the things that drives these sort of exponentials is feedback loops. So the reason something accelerates, I mean, let's think about silicon chips, right? Why did chips during the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s get better and faster? It was because there was a feedback loop. When Intel came out with a new chip, it allowed Microsoft to deliver better tooling on Windows, which gave people an incentive to upgrade their computers, which put money in the system, which allowed Intel to develop a new chip, which allowed Microsoft to push out more features. And that feedback loop accelerates. And so sometimes when I do my planning, I will also try to put those types of feedback loops in, because an outcome of a feedback loop will often be a curve that ultimately has that sort of that quality of taking off. And in a lot of places, you end up with these linear forecasts. And if you're sitting there and you're thinking, listen, I need to put in my budget request for next year for storage on S3, and I also need to give some indication of what's going to happen the year after and the year after that and the year after that. If it's growing linearly, I think you're making incredibly extreme assumptions based on what evidence has shown us. So you have to go back and start to say, how do I put in more realistic assumptions, even if it's going to freak the CFO out, because that's what history has shown us.